Welcome to Channel Air Canada is defying Trump's economic warfare with a masterclass in strategic resilience. What was meant to cripple Canadian businesses and pressure the country into submission through tariffs has instead backfired. Air Canada is announcing bold moves that showcase strength and adaptability. Air Canada has just unveiled 3 bold new U.S. routes for 2026, a move that underscores how Trump's punitive trade policies have spectacularly backfired. To grasp the significance of this expansion, we need to look back to March 2025, when Trump launched what many described as an economic assault on America's closest ally. These tariffs weren't merely about trade. They were about power, control, and Trump's peculiar fixation on treating Canada as if it were destined to become America's 51st state. This was harsh, Sandy. On the world stage, the U.S. president blasted the United Nations for failing to solve wars, failing to support U.S.-led peace efforts, and failing to live up to its potential. Trump even bragged that he had single-handedly solved 7 wars without so much as a phone call from the UN. He went further, openly scolding world leaders, urging them to close borders, expel foreigners, and abandon what he called the failed experiment of open borders. In his words, "Your countries are going to hell. End it now. I'm really good at this stuff." Trump also mocked the UN as a body of empty words, saying that all it ever does is issue strongly worded letters without follow-up. On climate change, his rhetoric was even sharper. After cutting funding for green energy and wind projects, he dismissed climate science as a con job, calling those who believe in global warming stupid. His denial wasn't just policy. It was a direct rebuke of decades of international scientific consensus. But here's what Trump didn't anticipate. His actions fundamentally reshaped how Canadians view America and how Canadian businesses respond to U.S. aggression. Air Canada's latest announcement comes at a time when cross-border travel has been hammered by these policies. The numbers tell the story. Canadian exports to the U.S. have fallen about 2% this year, a $5 billion hit, driven by tariffs that made Canadian goods more expensive for American buyers. But the real damage shows up in travel. The U.S. Travel Association once estimated that a 10% drop in Canadian tourism would cost $2.1 billion and 14,000 American jobs. The reality is far worse. Air travel plunged 22% year-over-year in June, marking 6 straight months of double-digit declines. Same-day trips fell 40.3% in May, with overnight travel down 34.3%. These aren't just statistics. They represent lost jobs, shuttered businesses, and billions in damage, all because Trump decided to pick a fight with America's most reliable ally. The human toll is visible in stories like Vancouver attorney Lena Yusufai's. A frequent visitor to Hawaii, she canceled her planned trip this year after Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods and boasted about turning Canada into the 51st state. "Out of loyalty to Canada and our values, we had to cancel," she said. Millions of Canadians share that sentiment, refusing to send their tourism dollars south. And this is where Air Canada's brilliance shines. While Trump alienated Canadian travelers, the airline pivoted toward expansion. Its 3 newly announced U.S. routes for summer 2026, Toronto to San Antonio and Montreal to Cleveland and Columbus, aren't about Canadian leisure flyers. They're about Sixth Freedom traffic. For those unfamiliar, Sixth Freedom routes allow Air Canada to funnel American passengers through Canadian hubs to reach Europe and Asia, often with better connections and prices than U.S. carriers. It's a business model that Trump's tariffs, ironically, have only strengthened by weakening American competition. Air Canada plans to boost transborder capacity by 15% in summer 2026, even as Prime Minister Mark Carney warns that Canada's old economic dependence on the U.S. is ending. This isn't a contradiction, it's strategy. Canadian leisure travel south has collapsed, but American demand for global connectivity remains robust. The choice of cities is telling. San Antonio, Cleveland, and Columbus are unaligned markets, mid-sized cities without dominant hub airlines. By targeting them, Air Canada positions itself to scoop up international business that U.S. carriers have overlooked. The unintended consequences of Trump's tariffs are staggering. Canadian exports to the UK have surged 63% since his inauguration, pushing Britain into Canada's #2 export destination, ahead of China. Canada hasn't just weathered Trump's economic assault. It has diversified away from U.S. dependence, the exact opposite of his intent. In short, Trump's tariffs didn't force Canada into submission. They fueled resilience, adaptation, and long-term strategy. And Air Canada's expansion is the clearest example yet of how his economic warfare backfired. The broader economic picture reveals just how badly Trump miscalculated. His tariffs aren't just hitting Canadians, they're hitting Americans too. Costs are rising, jobs are at risk, and North America's global competitiveness is eroding. While Canada has adapted by diversifying markets and strategies, U.S. businesses, especially in tourism, are bearing the brunt of the damage. Laura Hunt, CEO of Great Canadian Holidays, says most of her company's U.S. tours are dead in the water because Canadian customers have pulled back. This marks a structural shift in North American tourism that will outlast Trump's tariffs. Air Canada's strategy highlights the bigger story. Alongside 3 new U.S. routes for 2026, the airline is adding long-haul flights to Spain, Italy, Budapest, and Shanghai. This is more than expansion. It's a deliberate pivot away from reliance on the U.S. and toward global markets. In short, Air Canada is future-proofing itself against American political instability. The psychological fallout is just as significant. An Ipsos poll for Global News in early 2025 found that 68% of Canadians thought less of the U.S. after Trump's tariffs. That souring sentiment has shifted travel patterns. WestJet reports Canadian bookings moving away from the U.S. to destinations like Mexico and the Caribbean, redirecting billions of tourism dollars. The irony couldn't be sharper. Trump's tariffs were meant to make America stronger. Instead, they weakened U.S. competitiveness, accelerated Canada's diversification, and exposed America's unreliability as a partner. Air Canada's 2026 routes, Toronto to San Antonio, Montreal to Cleveland, and Montreal to Columbus, aren't just flights. They're strategic lifelines linking overlooked American cities to global markets through Canadian hubs. The airline is capitalizing on Sixth Freedom traffic, where Americans connect via Canada to Europe and Asia. It's a business model strengthened, not hurt, by Trump's missteps. The tariff war has also exposed the reality of North America's deeply integrated supply chains. By targeting Canada, Trump is inadvertently hurting U.S. auto plants, raising costs for American consumers, and threatening jobs on both sides of the border. In a global economy, protectionism backfires, always. Canada's response has been measured but firm. Ottawa is encouraging consumers to buy Canadian alternatives to U.S. products, reducing reliance on America and reinforcing domestic industry. Meanwhile, Air Canada is pushing forward with growth, but on its own terms. Seasonal routes from May through October, flexible capacity, and expansion into unaligned U.S. markets that lack dominant hub carriers. The lesson is clear. Canadian businesses aren't retreating. They're adapting, diversifying, and turning U.S. hostility into opportunity. The U.S. tourism industry alone is projected to lose up to $29 billion in 2025, much of it from lost Canadian travel. Those dollars are now flowing to Mexico, the Caribbean, and beyond. Air Canada's expansion is more than a business move. It's a statement of resilience. Trump's tariffs, designed to weaken Canada, have instead made it stronger, more independent, and better positioned globally. The ultimate irony is this. Economic nationalism hasn't made America great again. It has left it isolated, less competitive, and weaker, while Canada seizes the long-term advantage.